Okay, so I'm here in the National Museum of Military Vehicles. It's a privately built and funded museum, and honestly, I've been in all the Smithsonian's in Washington, D.C. and museums all over the country. That was my major, is history, and I just love museums. And this is maybe the best I've ever been in. It's just really, really well done. Super cool. So, you guys can, I'm just gonna quickly go through and show you pieces. I've done field trips here before, but I'm just gonna show you glimpses of it and hopefully keep it condensed and short. But there's so much, so you could spend all day here if you wanted. They have a gift shop, and then they have this history of weapons used in war, and you can come in here, and they have just from primitive weapons like flintlocks. This was supposedly one used in the Rebel. One of the things that they did tell me about this vault is it's one of only two. The other's at the Smithsonian, and it's a real vault. So this gun exhibit, because it's worth so much money, weapons are a collector's item. It has its own self-contained, so it is an actual vault with like bulletproof glass and stuff like that. Just this gun alone from the Revolutionary War is gotta be worth tons, but pretty cool. I didn't know it was operational. And they have these huge galleries that focus on different things. For example, this one's amphibious vehicles. And so they have the vehicles that could be on land or water that would carry personnel and so forth. And then they'll focus on like tanks, and they'll focus on different wars like Vietnam and Korea and so forth. But let me take you down here. This is amphibious vehicle and it could offload men or equipment. There's another one. Some of these were designed to be on water and land, and then others were just water. Also, with each of the exhibits, they have put these mannequins dressed in the uniforms and equipment that they would have used during that part of the war. So you can kind of get a visual for how things might have been. And they show you everything from simple motorcycles that they might have used during that time. For example, the Indian 841, to personnel or officer transport, to ambulances, to equipment hauling and so forth, and to the weapons they used. So, and then they have all these little placards around that tell you about every vehicle and so forth, and they have these huge murals that often have names and dates and information on that stuff. So again, I'm kind of rushing through, but I'll try and dwell on some things. I think it's interesting how they don't just show the big vehicles like tanks and these big amphibious vehicles, but they'll show simple things that you don't really think about, that like this kayak with a wind sail on it that was used in World War II. So, and it's just huge. It seems to go on forever. So let's go check out the tanks. They'll mix in Jeeps and so forth. They're trying to keep it, I think they're keeping it in periods like World War II and so forth, for the most part. And so they'll often give a history of the war as well on the walls. And then they have these really cool pictures, actual pictures from the war itself. So you can see the equipment in actual use. And then they'll talk about the production of these machines and so forth. I have quotes from presidents and military leaders and so forth. Here's a big tank room and reconnaissance vehicle, armored vehicle room. It's pretty amazing. see all these things in here. Just restored back to the way they would have looked for the most part. But they're the actual tanks and equipment that would have been used. And they have both sides of the war represented, mostly the American side, but they do tell you about the enemy side just so you can kind of have a picture of it. It's kind of cool. These tanks, they'll carry all kinds of equipment on them. Sandbags, ammunition, extra water, supplies, and so forth. And all the tanks are a little bit different in what the setup for them. And then their munitions. So, all these armored vehicles. Some of them are pretty complex. Like this is a recover vehicle, so it has a big old boom that swings out for a crane or a pulley system, so you can lift things and so forth. It has a bunch of equipment, tools, little guns poking out here and there, up on top, and then just a towing or pulling system and so forth. But so this was more of a tool than a weapon for the most part. And then these others that have these big booms on them and pulley systems and so forth for recovering things. This was interesting. I don't think it was here last time, but it's you can press pause and read this. But it talks about the engine inside of a tank and how big and complex it is, what drives that big heavy thing. We have signs that were up on the highways from the war that have been restored. Maybe they recreated it by a picture, but as they created roads across Europe or wherever they were fighting, and they're hauling equipment and everything, they would name the roads and stuff like that. And they had all these vehicles to haul equipment and to do work, build roads, repair roads, move equipment, broken down vehicles, so on and so forth. Some movies depict it, but war wasn't just about shooting guns and stuff. A lot of it, where they had success or won battles, was the capacity to build a road, maintain a road, keep the mud from bogging them down, and get fuel moved up to keep all the vehicles and tanks moving. Otherwise, everything came to a standstill, and then they could get attacked by the enemy and so forth. And sometimes that spanned weeks or months to get the equipment moved from here to there. And I'm mostly talking about World War II, and in my mind, that's what I'm thinking about, and Vietnam and so forth. I like the mannequins they have where they're wearing the clothes, so you can see what they're actually wearing. There's some winter exhibits that are pretty cool too. More of these guns on the ships. Torpedoes that you'd have out of the ships that would fire underwater, and they would try and blow up ships and so forth with those. Those are mines that would be underwater or floating that the ships could hit. They'd put out an aerial torpedo that a plane might carry and then drop into the water, and then it skims through the water. They have these big murals that talk about the history of the war. They have data from the war. You can press pause and read that. You often don't think of how many nations were involved in World War II. America lost 400,000 plus, but you know, like the Soviet Union lost 23 million, Poland lost 5.9 million, Korea lost 500,000, more than America. Japan lost 2.8 million. China lost 17 million people. The East Indies lost 3.5 million. France lost 600,000. Germany lost over 7 million. Greece lost over 600,000. So there were many, many nations that lost even more people than we did, even though we played a central role in the whole thing in making sure we were victorious. Interesting quotes from different leaders. And then this whole exhibit here is the Korea and Vietnam exhibit. It's really cool. I'll try and capture it, but you know, these ships would have thousands of personnel on them. And if they're hauling troops or they just help support and run the ship. So they have their own hospitals and mess halls and sleeping quarters and everything for these ships. These huge maps of Korea, North Korea, and the 38th parallel, and Vietnam, and they're just showing you the exhibit. This one's more artistic, I guess. It's more of an experience exhibit. They have lights and sound going, and then I'll show you back in here. It's more visually kind of engaging. So they have all the weapons from those wars, the Korean and Vietnam wars, and then they try and teach you the history of it. So there's one of those amphibious landing boats that lands, and then the men climb up. So a Winter War exhibit from the Korean War and what they might have been wearing. My mom's dad, my grandpa Ashmore, he passed away a few years ago, but he was a Marine, a combat Marine in the Korean War, and he wouldn't talk about it because it was so difficult for him, a lot of death and stuff around him. So I'm sure people that were in the war, if they walk through here, it probably triggers a ton of memories. My dad was in the Army because of the Vietnam War, but he never had to go. So he had mixed feelings about that. His friends were going and some were dying, but he didn't have to go. So it always troubled him a little bit. Here's the Vietnam exhibit. The 10,000 Day War. It was like 21 years long. So it spanned a couple of generations. Theoretically, a father and a son might be able to be in that war. But again, this one's helps you to feel. Also talk you through the jungle warfare and the outfits they wore and the weapons that were used, like the primitive weapons of the Viet Cong. and what they were wearing. Prisoners of war and how they were treated. And then this exhibit kind of gives you the feel of just kind of the darkness of the war with the jungle and the mysteriousness of what was going on as you went through the jungle. You can press pause and read that. And how scary it was just walking through and not really knowing what you were encountering. You know, you look back in here and there's someone popping up. There's tunnels all through the jungle. And they have these different exhibits and so forth as you come through here. It's a pretty cool experience. More weapons and tank stuff. You see how if you had spent days and days in there, it'd be kind of scary, and not scary, but just uncomfortable. They weren't built for comfort. Sandbags everywhere to create bases and safe zones and so forth. Munition bunkers. Little guard towers they build out of wood and then sandbags to be up there. Temporary. You know, the officers that were mapping all this out and organizing the campaigns, they needed offices and so forth to have communications and keep track of men and supplies and plan things out and so forth. So they'd set up these temporary offices. Machine gun nests. Someone would man that, sit behind it. Generators, running power everywhere. Big gas cans full of gasoline. Munitions boxes, weapons boxes. So my grandpa was in my grandpa Haywood, my dad's dad. I grew up right next to both my grandpas. And one was in World War II. And it was this kind of clean and not exciting, but the finish was positive. Everybody came home, welcome home to hero. My grandpa Ashmore was in the Korean War, a Marine. And that finish, it was a stalemate. North Korea was created, became communist. South Korea was liberated. And he came home and it was really messy, and it wasn't such a celebration. It was more like, did we win or not? And so it was interesting that both of them, almost the same age, a little bit different, were in two different wars that ended totally different feeling. And Vietnam was kind of like Korea, a little bit messy, or a lot messy. There's some probably more officer quarters, radio equipment, typewriters, send messages and memos, so forth. Infantry command post. And then this would probably be a foot soldiers camp. If you could get a tarp up, sleep under it. Got playing cards and rations and stuff. Recreation of a barracks. Things they might have in there. Sleeping quarters, hammocks, mosquito netting. And then how Vietnam and Korea became a living room war, where for the first time people had TVs and news. So people were living the war in their living rooms. There's a couple of interesting, and this quote is kind of emblematic of PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. I think that's what it is. guys that come back from war. It kind of shakes them up. My brother was in the Iraq War for 18 months. And when he came home, he was medically discharged after his 4 years, and he's a disabled veteran of a foreign war because, anyway, it just messes with people. These are a couple cool exhibits. These are 2 vehicles, almost like the first side-by-side or four-wheeler. That's a mechanical mule. You can press pause and read that if you want. Kind of a cool exhibit back here where they talk about the water forces in Vietnam and the brown water navy, the river rats, how they patrol the rivers and move supplies up and down, and how interesting and dangerous it was. They kind of give you a visual of what it would be like going up these scary jungle rivers, not really knowing what was happening with people coming in and out of the jungle. Here's another unique vehicle, the snow tractor. For a time, Alaska was heavily protected to make sure the Russians didn't come in through there. Well, it still is a big military focus for us. Quite a few bases up there and military presence. Different thoughts, so you can write things down and put them up. And this is really interesting. This whole mural is the different wars. America's service members, the Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, Air Force, Space Force, which is new, and the military conflicts we've had. And it goes from 2020 back. And so 2000, 1990, 1980, 70. And it shows the different conflicts we're involved in. And I think in one way or another, almost all of these are represented in here, although we do focus on the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and World War II. Maybe a little bit of World War I. But it goes all the way back to our founding and, the Revolutionary War, the American Revolution. 8 years long. That's where we started, and those are the conflicts we've been involved in. So I think I'm gonna wrap up this field trip. It's a really cool museum. You gotta come here and just experience it. Like I said, you can spend a whole day in here or half a day in here or multiple days. They do tours and so forth. In fact, I'm here because we're gonna do a face-to-face field trip. Students are coming to be here. I know I rushed through. I was just trying to give you a taste of everything. But it's a museum that keeps growing. They keep building buildings and so forth. But it makes you proud of, the sacrifices people have made. All of us probably have family members. My dad was in the Army. My wife's dad is a retired Air Force colonel. Her brother's an Air Force colonel right now. Both of my grandpas were in wars. My wife's grandpa was in multiple wars. And so my brother is a veteran of war. It's just, it makes you proud of those that we know that gave their time and energy and sometimes their lives to making sure people around the world were safe. Not just Americans, but everybody. We do a lot around the world to make sure everybody stays safe. So anyway, it's a cool place to come here sometime and enjoy the museum. A little bonus outside under this pavilion, they have a bunch of vehicles parked and some planes and other vehicles outside just sitting there because they can't fit inside. But this is a huge unit that I believe it's a bridge. It used to be inside. They pulled it out once they built out the exhibits a little more. But this folds out and flexes and sets, and it creates a bridge so they can get vehicles quickly across creeks and so forth. It's a pretty cool piece of equipment. Sorry about the wind. Snow go. Guess what that is? We know that in Wyoming, snowblower. Gotta clear the snow. All right, that's it. Thanks for coming.